Hi there. If you got to see this, I'd like to quickly introduce myself, who I am and what happened. My name is, or was, Eric LaBernich. I don't know what time or date it is, but I was born in 2023 in Germany and now I'm about 52 years old. So, I'm a German, but I don't think there are much Germans left to see this. I at least haven't seen one in a while. This is why I do this recording in English, because English was one of the most spoken languages in the world. The chances are much higher that whoever sees this in the future will speak English instead of German. However, all countries, including the English-speaking ones, got extremely depopulated, so the chances are high that no one ever will see this. Maybe this is the last message from mankind ever recorded. I don't know. I found this almost ancient looking Nokia camera a minute ago in this old rotten, shed kind of thing in the middle of the woods, and was very surprised that it's still charged, because electricity went off about almost a decade ago. However, since I have the opportunity now, I just decided to leave this message for you. Oh, and please excuse any mistakes and mispronunciations. English is not my mother language. Well, how to begin? I really don't know how many humans are still alive worldwide, but the number is low. Just for you to understand, when I was born in 2023, the number of all people together worldwide were about 8 billion. But I personally think we shrink to maybe 500,000 souls worldwide as of today, because the last news I heard almost 10 years ago spoke about 3/4 of all humans are dead, and so many more died since then, so we almost must have gotten wiped out by now. Well, I'm not sure if it affected native people who still live like our ancestors thousands of years ago in rainforests or deserts, but for sure the so-called first world countries were massively affected. It all might have begun with the Roswell incident in the USA in 1947, so about 130 years ago, because after that incident we as humans made huge progresses with electronic devices, which was the beginning from our end. I mean, first it was very good. We got a lot of economic growth and wealth and sneaky gadgets like this camera and whatnot, but it really started to get kind of control around 1990, I'd say. This was a time when people got more and more used to use computers. But over time, this made them much weaker because they just sitting around all the time. They lost muscle mass and eyesight from staring at the screens all the time, and they began to get ill much faster when they went out, so they stayed at home even more to prevent illnesses and went to the doctors much more and took medicines against this and that all the time, which made them even more ill, weaker and also addicted. However, over the next decades, computers and everything got more advanced, and then so-called flat screens pinned people in front of them even more, using special waves or frequencies or hertz rates or whatever those things emitted, but for sure it kind of hypnotized the people and made them dull. The governments already had experimented way before 1990 with a lot of different waves and frequencies which were affecting people in one way or another. There were waves to make people puke or poop or even willing to kill themselves, but also there were waves who could make people happy or sad or dull. Around the year 2000, people got used to have computers at home and small computers in their pockets called smartphones, which were also able to access the internet and with it all the knowledge of the world. But instead of getting smarter, people only were sitting around alone even more, playing one of the millions of available computer games, or worse, were watching so-called Let's Plays, where people could watch other people playing those computer games instead of playing those games themselves, or even worse, were watching dumb shit like the Tide Pod Challenge, which was basically eating washing powder. Humans got dumber by the hour and were distancing and isolating ourselves more and more. And also people got weaker and weaker by the year. And also a lot of us slowly lost the ability to think for themselves, because now algorithms and AIs did it for us. The people just watched willingless advertisements, millions of advertisements, and stupid crap all the time on their smartphones and flat screens. However, it must have been around the year 2010 when the first zombies were spotted. Zombies were basically people who were staring at their smartphones all the time, and they behaved a lot like zombies from horror movies when they were walking, hence the name zombie, but I'll come to that later. So, the people lost more and more the ability to talk proper, to read and write, and to socialize. Everyone was just sitting alone. Therefore, less and less birth happened in countries who had these technologies. All this was a result from the dulling waves, or what you would call it, the electronics emitted, because they kept the people sitting alone, glued to screens and not interested in anything else anymore, not even in the most popular activity since mankind came into existence. I mean, sex. Those who still had a sex life did a lot to prevent pregnancies. A lot of them just fucked around for fun, but did not want a partner or a family. This had different stupid reasons they got implanted from the so-called social media, like having fun was the main goal in life, or preferring working their asses off for just things like expensive cars or designer clothes instead of having loving children and a loving family. The real fulfillment of a human life got replaced by false fulfillments. But it got even worse. Movements of people came up who demanded that humans should have no babies at all, because suddenly it was claimed that babies produce a lot of CO2. That's a gas, in case you don't know, which was said to harm the environment and support climate change, which would cost us our lives. Suddenly, besides farting cows, now our own babies were one of the biggest CO2 polluters and climate killers, and the people really believed it. So people started to prevent births because of fear of CO2 and climate warming. But at the same time, people demanded more and more goods like electric cars and much more meat and whatnot, whose productions produced so much more CO2. Then people went crazy with not only supporting but also promoting abortions up to the last month, and even euthanizing the old and sick people. And later on they also euthanized the homeless and everyone who just wanted to end his life. But it got even worse. People got confused what sex they were. After existing for at least 250,000 years, we suddenly couldn't tell anymore the differences between male and female. Suddenly, hundreds of new sexes, so-called genders, popped up, and people got used to love their own sexes or no sexes at all. That meant even less upsprings. Then the poorer countries, so-called second and third world countries, which still had good birth rates and so far healthy but undereducated people, got entangled in wars the first worlds like the USA had started, and then a vast majority of the citizens of said countries were moved to first world countries like France, Germany and Sweden, just to name a few. They flooded themselves on purpose with undereducated people. Now I know why that happened, but I'll come to that. I remember that when I was a child there were some religious clashes here and there, because these undereducated people were very religious, but it took just a few more years and it stopped, because those people's brains also got numbed by the waves all these electric devices emitted, because now everyone had to have a mobile phone or a computer, and almost everyone had a TV, so a flat screen. They were just everywhere and almost unavoidable. So almost everyone got affected without realizing it. I would compare this effect to an alcoholic who drank every day and stated that everything is okay with him and he's normal like always, but an outstander would have noticed that this is not the case, because the person would slowly change in behavior and many other things due to the alcohol consumption. You know, the people got dumber, more entitled, even more ignorant and much more duller from day to day. They were so much divided and far from each other, they fought each other for absolutely everything. I mean, religious beliefs, fat against skinny, old against young, left against right. You just name a reason and there was a fight. Imagine, the people even fought over money they never had, because by this time the governments already got rid of money and now citizens use plastic cards and their smartphones to pay and get paid. The money we had before that were coins and banknotes, and they were pretty worthless themselves, but we believed in the 50 or the 10 which was printed on it, and at least you had something in your hand physically. Now, with just numbers in a computer somewhere, there was nothing physical we could grab and nothing of real value at all, but so many of us fought for some numbers in a computer somewhere with their lives. However, other people suddenly thought they were animals like wolves, cats or foxes, or not from this world at all. They made up some stupid pronouns like seer or xem and expected everyone else to use them without knowing them. People started to love trees or sex dolls or the Eiffel Tower or any other material thing, but no other human. Females were fighting males, accusing them to be mansplaining all the time or to fight for some far-fetched patriarchy, while men got kind of, made gay, not interested in women anymore. Overall, men were no longer seen as the head of the family, but rather a lesser life form which had nothing else in mind than raping women all the time, while more and more men, on the other hand, dreamed to be a woman or dreamed about fucking other men's asses. You see, when I was born in 2023, it was still okay to give birth as a hetero couple, but a few years later, around 2030, it wasn't anymore. If a woman gave birth to a baby without permission, she ended up in prison and the child in government foster care. If there was a father, he got arrested too, and both had to pay for the so-called care, but never got to see their child again. Governments introduced harsh birth controls because of overpopulation, even if they knew already at this point that it was predicted that the population of humans would start to decline by 2050 because of overaging and much too less birth. However, any couple who legally wanted to have a baby first needed to be allowed to have one, and then they got a DNA-modified lab-grown one. This should have helped to prevent diseases and give the parents exactly the baby they wanted, for example with blue eyes and a high IQ, but we later found out, when it really was too late, that the human race got fooled by the scientists because all of those modified offsprings turned out to be infertile. So, it was really horrible, but it even got worse. Back in 2030, children got taught already since over 10 years the so-called gender equality, and even 2-year-olds got mobile phones and gaming consoles and TVs in kindergarten to play with and to look at. That resulted in people not only with a high IQ they couldn't use, but so damn confused that they never could find out what sex they were and what they were originally attracted to. Boys were made girls and vice versa, and to love the same sex or all sexes to have sex with suddenly were kind of normal. The few ones who did find out later in life and then preferred just the opposite sex to have sex with suddenly were kind of not normal. It was said they were not inclusive enough and homophobe. For example, to women attracted men not wanting having sex with another fat black man who identified as the white skinny woman made the man some kind of racist, a misogynist, a Nazi and whatnot. Anyhow, you could buy whatever sex you liked everywhere, not only in shady streets, but also online on thousands of internet platforms. It was like in this story from the Bible, Sodom and Gomorrah, and maybe it was Sodom and Gomorrah we lived in and we almost got wiped out by God because of that same behavior like the Bible told us about. I don't know. But speaking about the Bible, people had the tradition to have Christmas trees for Christmas, which was the birthday of God's Son, Jesus. I mention this because a lot of people already had forgotten about Jesus when I grew up. For them, only Santa Claus existed a figure which was invented by the Coca-Cola company around 1900, so to increase the consumption of Coca-Cola. But in the end, Santa Claus increased the consumption of everything, and Christmas became a pure consumption event. Around 2024, people started to erect huge anal plugs instead of Christmas trees. They said those are modern art Christmas trees, but they looked no different to huge anal plugs. In the end, those anal plug Christmas trees became the new Christmas trees and helped to sell much more anal plugs than ever. Even kids got their own ones from Santa Claus. But despite all the sex offers and huge anal plugs everywhere, humans were dying out. All the wars we fought over the years decimated us massively, and the ones which were left after the last Great War against everything and everybody were, beside the infertile DNA-modified humans, either too old to reproduce or already chemically castrated. You know, back in the days, people accepted biofoods as the better food and were willing to pay much more for it. But before all the bad foods were invented by companies to gain more profits, there were only biofoods on everyone's table, until they were replaced with non-biofoods for the majority. These non-biofoods made people sick over decades. They got all sorts from illnesses from it, like fat liver or cancer, and overall it reduced the sperm production in men and egg production in women. But because it was spiked with ingredients like glutamate and sugar, which made the people kinda like addicted, they ate it all the time, and then they oddly started to promote, for example, having no kids or the fat positivity movement, even if everybody should have known that to have a massive overweight or no children at all is far from a healthy society. Oh, and not to forget the time between 2020 and 2022, which was called the Corona pandemic. In this time, the people were scared to death with reports from this pandemic. Governments told their citizens that millions of people could die from it, and everybody was horrified. But then vaccines came out very quickly and people rushed to get them. For those who didn't rush to get the vaccinations because they were a little hesitate, there was a kind of depression which took place in those 2 years. They were threatened with losing their jobs and whatnot, and many bowed down from the pressure to take the vaccine. But then, suddenly it seemed like people who got the jabs died in greater numbers, like people had died from the pandemic. Also, suddenly a lot of women couldn't get pregnant anymore or had miscarriages, and a lot of people got weird illnesses like turbo cancer or sudden heart attacks and whatnot, and a lot of the vaccinated died or were crippled for life. So, over the next few decades, we humans got decimated really quick for different reasons. My mother was one of the very few who did not bow under the pressure of the first corona vaccination wave, because she was deep into the so-called dread housewife movement, which basically meant that she was just a traditional housewife like 100 years ago, whose sole job the family was. She was seen as a crazy by other people, like, why didn't she want a career, a lot of money, holidays all the time, and thousands of sex partners for fun instead of just one lame husband, and the crying and pooping and this horrible CO2 gas emitting baby. But because she was at home all the time and had no employer, she kinda slipped under the radar with me. This is why I was born a healthy baby and stayed a healthy baby, because my birth was not submitted to the government, so it had no clue that I existed. I never got any vaccines, and I also never watched TV because I wasn't in kindergarten. My parents had me at home and we had no TV, which was not only rare, but almost unheard of in the 30s. However, my parents finally had to bow down to a vaccination when the second corona wave was announced in 2028. Much less people died after this, but sadly, about half a year later, my father died from a heart attack and my mother lost my unborn sibling, probably as a result of the forced vaccination, so I stayed a single secret child. Because I was a secret child, I never visited a school, but got homeschooled by my mother instead. She taught me to be an outdoorsman until she also passed away in 2042. This is why I know where to find food outdoors and others did not. They never learned about edible white plants or how to trap animals or how to start a fire. They just learned useless crap like religions and how many made-up genders there were. However, let me summarize the events I just told you about real quick. Starting in the 1990s, people got weaker and more isolated and dull by just sitting around all the time. About a decade later, it got much worse with the introduction of smartphones and flat screens emitting these dull-making waves. People refused to reproduce, more and more men went gay and women went lesbian. And on top, a lot of those who went not gay or lesbian and could have reproduced were made ill and infertile by processed industrial foods full of chemicals like aspartame. And then those repeatedly on people forced mRNA vaccinations, which surprisingly also interfered with the waves smartphones and flat screens emitted, made the people even further into ill, willingless robots. The last ones, which could have saved the human race by starting a new population in peace, massacred themselves in the last Great War from 2062 until 2066. Yeah, May 2066 is the date when our so-called civilization finally came to an end. Humans had finally thrown atomic bombs on themselves. But this was still not the worst. Much worse was that shortly after, atomic reactors started to melt due to nobody left to maintain them, which caused massive contamination of vast parts of the land around the reactors due to a deadly radioactivity. Germany was lucky, so to say, because in contrary to, for example, France, which had many atomic power plants, Germany had not a single one, because Germany got rid of all atomic power plants back in 2020 or around that time. This had caused massive electricity problems for many years, but now it turned out to be a good thing because the land was nowhere contaminated. As you may know, atomic contamination can last up to 380,000 years, so I feel really bad for France and other countries which had atomic reactors. The land will be uninhabitable for a long time, and that's why I don't go there. However, the few supermarkets and shops which still sold something up to this point finally closed, and then the electricity went out. And when the electricity went out, all hope was lost, because the surviving humans even couldn't start a fire anymore. You know, there was a time where humans had thought that we would become godlike creatures with cloning animals, fruits, crops, and our own babies and whatnot. But then, after the war, a lot of the very few remaining people even couldn't kill an animal. I mean, they could kill it maybe, but weren't able to skin and slaughter them correctly, or at all. They never had done it before. All the meat they ever ate they bought in supermarkets, so they had no idea what to do. Often they even failed in catching animals because they were not able to trap them. But if someone butchered something, a lot of people ate their fish and meat raw, and with that they got parasites like tapeworms and nematodes, which they died from as well because there were no doctors, no medicine, and no knowledge about this left. Also, the majority of the remaining people were vegetarians and vegans since decades, because people got the idea implanted to avoid meat because of the farting cows I already mentioned. So, eating meat got completely replaced by eating insects after 2035, and meat was only available to the richest from then on. And to me, of course, because I know where to get it. However, after the war, the people just couldn't grow their own vegetables and crops anymore because everything was DNA modified since many years from companies like Monsanto. To have and to grow not modified vegetables and crops was made illegal I think already 2 decades before I was born, but because my parents were such freaks and had inherited real seeds from their parents, which they had from their parents and so on, I grew up with real vegetables and still carry their seeds with me. But all the other people who did gardening as a hobby depended on buying all their seeds from those companies. But when everything broke down after the last Great War, there were no seeds anymore to buy and to plant. Of course, first people planted the still available seeds, but those seeds didn't make new seeds because of the modifications. So this was a huge problem for us, and it explains why so many people starved to death after 2066. Not to mention all the other problems people got killed by. For example, in the very harsh year 2068, where there was no real summer but an almost 18-month-long winter because of massive volcanic eruptions somewhere, maybe in Ireland or Iceland, I don't know. Many more people starved to death because whatever was still growing at this point died, and we humans with it. Another example is that since a lot of people were on medicines like antibiotics their whole life, but after 2066 not anymore, they got ill real quick and died fast because their bodies had no own immune system. And all of a sudden, there were no people walking around anymore. You see, when I say no people, then I mean no rational thinking people like me, because from time to time I still stumble over one of the already mentioned zombies. Again, basically a zombie is a human who just stumbles around staring at a mobile phone. But while the very first zombies were just that, so people who were heavily distracted by their phones and then running into things, the zombies I'd call the third zombie generation nowadays are really brain dead and are looking at phones which are out of service since almost a decade. But what keeps them watching at their dead phones is the 6G transmission, which still powers the dead phones somehow, so that the screen is still flickering, and that keeps the zombies watching. Why the 6G is still working, I'll explain in a minute. But first, zombies exist for 2 reasons. First, the waves from their phones and screens slowly grilled their brains out, and second, people got implanted so-called RFID chips into their bodies. Those chips were promoted first around the millennium, I'd say, but were getting really popular after 2026. First, people implanted them into their bodies to be cool and innovative, like to pay with their wrists instead of cards or phones. But by 2060, almost all people had them implanted. It was normal then. However, just one day after humans started to throw atomic bombs on themselves, the RFID chips, together with the mRNA vaccines and the waves from the devices, suddenly took over all those people's minds at once and made them into willingless zombies. The zombies of the second generation, who had no RFID chips implanted but had gotten the vaccines, died relatively quick on starvation in some corner while swiping the screen of a dead cell phone, but those with implanted RFID chips still manage to this day to survive and to find food somehow with what's left from their brains. Mostly they eat corpses like dead birds or other animals they stumble upon, but basically they eat everything what is edible and they can get their hands on. Interestingly, they don't eat each other. I don't know why that is, but they seem to recognize their kind somehow. Maybe it has something to do with the RFID chips? Well, I don't know. What I know is that the zombies sometimes look really horrible with cancer growing out of them and whatnot. I mean, it's really horrible, I tell ya. Zombies are also dangerous to me because they are man-eaters. Once they sense me, or any other person for this matter, which is not chipped and vaccinated, they will come run towards us and will demand extremely aggressive, either a mobile charger or a password, and if you don't give it instantly to them, they try to kill you in their raging madness. I think this might be a rest of the egoistic entitlement the people had developed over the decades until the end. However, after that, they would eat you raw while staring on their dead fucking damn phones. It's really sad. because we are already such a few people. The last normal person I've seen over 2 years ago, I met another wanderer in 2017, and we were wandering together since then. But while he was dumping his shit in a ditch, he got surprised and then quickly strangulated by a zombie with a phone charger when the zombie found out the password he had given didn't work. He even wasn't able to stand up or to wipe his ass before he got killed. But of course, in return, I killed the zombie, but it was already too late for my friend. His windpipe was crushed and he died in my arms. But the most horrible thing is that everything that has happened the last 130 years or even much longer was orchestrated by aliens who, with the help of all the things I've mentioned so far, keep the zombies alive to harvest them one day. I believe that the aliens came to our planet not to fight us, but latest after they crash landed and we killed and tortured them and experimented on them and ripped them off of their technologies, which we never fully understood. They used exactly this technology against us to wipe us from the planet, to conquer it for themselves. But they didn't just start a war with us, they had their fun with us, stupid humans. That's at least what I think. In the beginning, because humans are greedy and dumb, the aliens were able to get us on their side, obviously luring a lot of us in with promises of might and wealth and a much more comfortable lifestyle, and because people wanted that, they helped the aliens unknowingly to get rid of their own species by introducing all that fancy stuff like bad foods, flat screens, smartphones and mRNA, RFID, AI and whatnot. Have you ever heard from humans sacrificing other humans? A lot of tribes did that in ancient times. Most known for this were the Aztecs and the Mayas from South America. They sacrificed to the gods and dumped the sacrifices into water. Did they do it for the aliens from whom they believed were gods to keep them calm? It could be, because the aliens live under the sea where we never can reach them, and now they are the new rulers of this planet. And we ended up confused, brainwashed, poisoned, ill, and in the end, nearly all of us dead. However, I never saw an alien in my life, and nobody I ever met seemed to know where they came from or how they looked like or called themselves. This is still a mystery. All I know is that they are still here because I see them flying around sometimes. The aliens can't live on the land, it seems, because they just fly over it in machines the people always call UFOs. I think they can't get out because they need another pressure than humans to survive or something. You see, we humans wanted to colonize planet Mars for a long time, but we didn't do it because we would have faced the same problems as the aliens. The pressure on Mars is just not right for us, and we would have died immediately when we had tried to wander unprotected over the surface of the red planet. However, what I know is that their machines have the ability to paralyze humans instantly or to even pulverize them at the spot. But I think they don't do it anymore. I mean, they could have done it with me several times over the last years, but they didn't. But they did it in the past. There were countless reports of people who got abducted and experimented on or vanished without a trace or were found later somewhere in the woods or on a mountain, sometimes with amnesia, but in most cases dead and often without a drop of blood. I don't think they eat us, but maybe they drink our blood or something because, they still harvesting zombies. I've seen that, and they keep the zombies alive with 6G and all that on purpose to harvest them one day. So there's definitely a plan for them behind that. Since I have a lot of time thinking about everything, I already thought that maybe those aliens are the god the Bible mentions, or all gods every religion ever mentioned. Maybe they are not here since 1947 AD, but since 1947 BC, or even longer? It could be, because old scripts from the Egyptians and other long-gone civilizations suggested that. Maybe they were always here and we were just an experiment all along, but I'll never know, I guess. Have you heard from the Jar Jar Guidestones? Nobody knew who erected them overnight in 1980 in Georgia, but they stated that humanity should be maintained under 500 million people. It could be that the aliens erected them, and if we are really still 500 million people, then the majority of them are zombies in cities, but I avoid cities because of the zombies, so I don't know for sure. But that there are much more zombies than people like me is very obvious. Maybe the aliens kindly cut it out 3 zeros from the 5 million for us as an extra punishment for our dumbness after some other dumb humans destroyed the guide stones in 2022. But that's just another thing I don't know. However, maybe... Damn. I see the camera is signaling that the batteries are empty, so it will die soon. I'd like to tell you much more, because so many things happened which tried to reduce humanity. For example, and most notable, how the church suddenly was into preventing birth by allowing anti-baby pills and condoms and whatnot, but there's no time left. One last thing, the climate change the people were so afraid of for decades never happened. At least not as we were told. As you can see, nothing is flooded and nothing is desert. Oh, look, there's a zombie. Do you see it? What's the zombie doing in the forest? However, I hope that informations were enough to shed a light on what happened to us humans in this part of the world. I'll continue my journey now, but I tell you, to be alone all the time is the worst torture. Humans are mammals and also herd animals, and to be alone all the time drives not only me crazy. But if I see another human, it's always just a zombie, like the one outside. And the only thing you can do to help these poor zombie souls out of their misery is to kill them before they kill you. They'll never come back from their delusional state, and a sudden death will keep them from whatever horrible fate they would have after the aliens harvested them. As for me, I hopefully cross my path with a greater human colony in the nearer future to finally get settled down after almost 10 years of wandering and seeing and talking to almost nobody. My dream would be to meet a woman who's still able and willing to have children, so I'm imagining myself as kind of being the chosen one, or Adam from the Bible, meeting his Eva someday and then helping to repopulate this planet not only with fresh humans but also fresh vegetables, you know. But I guess that's just another stupid dream from a stupid human, because there's simply nobody left with these requirements, it seems, and I'm getting too old for that shit. Anyway, this was Eric LaBernich signing off into an unknown future.